I must lie down where all the ladders start, in the foul rag and bone shop of the heart.
William Butler Yeats understood that poetry was a process which started furthest away from its goals in the most depraved and disgusting of conditions, and it and we ascended to a higher point with it. What I'm going to attempt to do here is argue that while Yeats was a pretty rock and roll guy for a poet, the trope of the rock and roll poet is in fact a load of old galumphary. The songwriting and poetry, while not mutually exclusive activities, are rare and usually coincidental. There are a lot of people who may poo-poo my position, and far be it from me to turn my nose up at poo-poo. But I'll also try and explain why those naysayers say nay, and why I remain a skeptic. To do this, we're going to do two quick things first. Some shedding of personal baggage, and an attempt to define terms as I see them. And then we'll look at some of the usual suspects when the fallacy of pop song poetry is trotted out. For me, the greatest man who ever lived was my grandfather, George. He wasn't from the Norwegian side of the family, that was my dad's side. But George was, on the outside anyway, a tough Geordie like his father Bill. He was a soldier and all his sons, my uncles, wore uniforms too. But George had another side. He loved poetry. His great favourite was Shelley, but he read widely and he read to me, and I guess some of that rubbed off on me. I wasn't so big into the romantics like him, but I grew up surrounded by ink and paper poetry. Later on, when I was playing in bands, the task of writing lyrics for songs fell invariably to me. I didn't want it or seek it. I got it either because no one else wanted to do it, or it was just one of those jobs like being the bass player that you got for being a cool guy and they just had to give you something to do. It was a task I hated because it was hard and I was bad at it. I eventually told them I wouldn't do it anymore when we were recording our first single, and our singer decided on the fly to change some of my hard-won, hard-lived lyric, because apparently masturbating to Marvin Gaye wasn't a suitable topic for airplay at the time, and besides there were work experience kids in the studio that night and he didn't want to swear in front of school children. I think the job was so hard for me because when I listen to music, I wanted to invoke a physical response from me. It has to make me want to dance, or wave my arms about, or tap my feet, or pick up a guitar and bash out some hot licks, or just sit there grunting like James Brown at appropriate junctures. I go to the drummer first. If the drummer is hip and making it happen, hooray! But if the drummer is lazy or bland, it's generally a pass. Of course, if the drummer is enthusiastic and incompetent, that's solid gold. I listen to voices very keenly, but not necessarily what they are saying. Now and then something witty or interesting will pop out that catches me, as will something egregiously stupid, but what a lyric has to say usually doesn't register with me. So I'm biased, but my thesis is this. Song lyrics, try as they might, will never be true poetry, and any songwriter who claims or is acclaimed to be a poet is usually what Leonard Cohen called one of the thousands.
Out of the thousands who are known or who want to be known as poets, maybe one or two are genuine and the rest are fakes, hanging around the sacred precincts, trying to look like the real thing. Needless to say, I am one of the fakes, and this is my story.
And that's my thesis. I understand it may not be immediately a popular one, and if you have an antithesis to my thinking here, well, that's why God gave us a comment section and Hegelian dialectics for later.
Good songwriting is a mysterious art. Paul Kelly, that most venerable of Australia's songsmiths, once said that if I knew how to write a good song, I'd be at home doing it now. Leonard Cohen once described it as a mysterious condition. Neil Young opined on people who said that they understood songwriting. Some might say that they don't know. And Lou Reed, when pressed how he wrote songs, proffered, I don't have a clue. In the formative days of pop songwriting, music and lyrics were usually written by a team. Typically working cheek and jowl, lyricists worked to tailor their tales to the tunes, and writers built structures into the songs to accommodate themes and ideas put forward by their lyricists. But, as always in pop music, lyricists were constrained by the overriding fact that in pop music, form always dominates function. It's much easier to adapt the cadence, scansion and diction of a vocalist to fit a melody or rhythm than it is to break the compositional structure to accommodate a lyric. This continued into the era of the brill-building style pop songwriting and then into the singer-songwriter era. That, in a nutshell, is one of the key reasons pop song lyrics can never be considered true poetry. For example, in many songs' lyrics, the verse is irregular in so much as it required metric variation in order to fit. That's called prosodic dissonance, or Eminemic pentameter, because hip-hop post Biggie Smalls relies almost wholly on it. An example is in Hey Jude, where Paul McCartney forces 2 extra syllables into take a sad song and make it better, because it's much more aesthetically pleasing for the lyrics to vary in cadence or rhythm than it is to randomly change a bar of music. Of course, the Beatles were no strangers to odd bar length changes, but then again, they were done and the lyrics had to follow them. In other cases, the lyrics adhere strictly to the beat. Early hip-hop, for example, where the art of the song was to make the lyric fit, which constrained and dictated a lyric choice. Poetry doesn't start with a predetermined meter verse structure. Pop song lyrics have not only to accommodate the verse, but also frequently middle eights and bridges and a chorus, but is determined by the cadence, the words that frame the concept the poet creates. In the formative days of pop songwriting, lyricists like Johnny Mercer, Ira Gershwin, Yip Harburg, or Irving Berlin valued economy of language. Mercer, very direct and conversational. Gershwin's lyrics every bit as witty and urbane as his Genius Brothers compositions. Harburg, winsome, hopeful, and capable of drawing great sympathy from a listener. Or Berlin, who used simple, sincere themes, and they relied on very precisely weighted words designed to be sung by any singer, which is why they're still beloved today. There were other songwriters such as Cole Porter, Dorothy Fields, or Alan Lerner who were given to more ambitious wordplay, but the key was that they all avoided what was known as prolix, or overwordiness, and that was a key device of the way they adapted their words to convey the idea of the song. Economy and weight of language is one of the key differentiators of poetry from what is known as doggerel. The songwriters who followed them into the rock and roll era obeyed pretty much the same rules, see TRB 105, but as the music becomes compositionally simpler and less audacious, the lyrics seem to revolve around a narrower range of subjects. Occasionally, someone like Jerry Goffin or Cynthia Weil would contemplate the human condition or address social issues in songs like Up on the Roof or Uptown, but the songs subsisted more around snappy catchphrases than fully developed ideas, and seldom strayed narratively from the central conceit. Ellie Greenwich was a huge exception to this rule. She was a skillful storyteller. Then He Kissed Me is a mini Scott Fitzgerald novella. With the arrival of the singer-songwriter, though, the bounds began to stretch. Because singers were now obtaining songs that were suited solely to their unique voices, they could be more expansive in both their subjects and the choice of words they used. With the arrival of Bob Dylan and the attendant admiration heaped on him, the notion of rock music equating to poetry emerged. Dylan, to his immense credit, so much so that for that alone he warranted his Nobel Prize, realised that his work was in danger of being governed by the expectations of others, so he turned their own piety back on them with It Ain't Me, Babe, and at that point, realising he could get away with just about anything, proceeded to write reams of outrageous doggerel, which instantly granted him the position of voice of a generation. So myopic was the adoration in which he was held, he got all the way to 1969, writing all sorts of crap, whether it made sense or not. How do you stand all along a watchtower? You stand in or on a watchtower. You stand along a wall. Then he released a remarkable record called Nashville Skyline, full of simplistic lyrics that barely pretended to be literature, much less poetry, and the fans still pored over it and hailed him a genius afresh. Good poetry intends to evoke deeper thought or emotion. It resonates with universal themes, even in its simplicity, loving, losing, dancing, drinking, fucking, and it guides the reader to explore complex layers, to climb the ladders it starts. There's often an element of ambiguity or openness to interpretation, allowing readers to engage more personally, but the language is constructed to retain the initial frame of reference. What Dylan learned how to do consciously, and many of his imitators failed to appreciate as they stupidly aped him, was the skill of the ad man or the brill buildinger, the ability to plant a single resonant line, whether it meant anything or not, a hook, a catch line to pull the listener in. You don't need a weatherman to know which way the wind blows, which pops up at the end of a song, which is nothing more than a series of snappy phrases that invoke a state of mind, but don't make a case for anything. You can do it just at the start of the song too. Ain't it just like the night to play tricks when you're trying to face the quiet, which gives away the whole song. All that follows after that is a descendingly bizarre ramble of words spoken just because they seem to fit together in a certain way. Shows you nothing, takes you nowhere. Stuck inside a mobile with the Memphis Blues again, doesn't even bother with the scene setting. All songs pivot around line. He not busy being born is busy dying. That's a very true and profound point, but it appears 45 seconds into a 7.5 minute long song, which, while full of fresh quotable quotes, does nothing to advance or reinforce that or any other point it happens to raise. I was so much older then, I'm younger than that now. A stunning rejoinder at the end of an avalanche of boulder dash, which leads you to ask, as you do with so many of his songs amongst that hailstorm of words, what's it actually about? Now, there are points that Dylan does have in common with legitimate poetry. He does value scansion, even if it is sacrificed somewhat for the musicality, especially as he gets older. He does use force of vivid imagery, and he also, with age, developed the lightness of touch. But he did lose, for better or for worse, the ability to summon what he called the penetrating magic of his lyrics, and we can see, especially from Love and Theft onwards, occasionally amusing attempts to imitate himself in that older style. Some say his style changed after his 1974 association with painter Norman Rabin, who taught him to think about songs as narratives that move in non-linear patterns, and his songwriting certainly became more interesting for that, dominating Blood on the Tracks, Desire and Street Legal. But then Jesus came along and he went right back to his broadside style of 1962-3. After that, he was lost for a long time, unable to discover why he wanted to write songs. Apart from to pay alimony, any album from Infidels to Under the Red Sky amply demonstrates this. After a brush with death in the early 90s, though, he found the role that actually won him the Nobel Prize, the curator and repurposer of American folk language. Songwriters will pour out a torrent of words trying to express simple situations. I was listening to, and don't ask me why, long story, a Dire Straits CD late one night, and it ended on a song called It Never Rains. And I made a point of trying to listen to the lyrics. Now, Mark Knopfler, whom I assume wrote the words, he used 447 of them. And when you paste them out on a page, they say absolutely nothing. There's no movement in the narrative. The circus motif was thin and laboured, and the disjunct between the circus setting and the weather report that end rhymed the chorus made no sense. The words were just there to fill in the time in the song so Knopfler could run off a couple of extra mellifluous guitar solos. By way of contrast, in 1956, in barely a handful more words than that, Allen Ginsberg deconstructed the experience of the disillusion of affluence, saw the best minds of his generation destroyed, hallucinated Arkansas, drank turpentine in Paradise Alley, and howled as Baltimore gleamed in supernatural ecstasy. In only a little more time than Knopfler spent mimicking 1965 Bob Dylan to say nothing, Ginsberg captured the first bloom of the disease of self-doubt that manifests itself in America to this day. An artist only marginally less lauded than Bob Dylan, and his opposite in so many ways, is Leonard Cohen, a man who was, before joining the Legion of Croaky Folkies in 1967, a very clear-eyed and insightful poet and novelist of no little success. But he too found ultimately that poetry did not translate to music, not least popular music. Most of his previous poems he tried to adapt had to be unsuccessfully compromised. Some, like Joan of Arc, succeeded, and gradually his songwriting effects began to limit the effects of his legitimate poetry. Later in life, his adoption of Zen Buddhist thinking fatally compromised his work. As he said in The Guardian, the one reliable source of people saying stupid and irresponsible things, I don't think you work out something. I wouldn't call them ideas. I think ideas are what you want to get rid of. I don't really like songs with ideas. And he fell into a style where he was economical with words, but they just didn't say much. Cohen failed the essential litmus test that 99% of songwriters fail when you try to define their work as poetry. Song lyrics, as we've said, exist for and in the context of music. Poetry exists in the context of silence. Lyrics only come to life when they're surrounded by music. Poetry only comes to life when it's naked. Impossible as this might be, take any of Dylan's work, any of it at all, and read just the lyrics in your head to yourself, free of any context of music. What is clear and alive as a song is frequently bewildering and incomprehensible as text. Same with any of Cohen's post-1967 work, or Joni Mitchell, or Jim Morrison, or Pete Sinfield, or Robert Hunter, or Taylor Swift, or God forbid Lana Del Rey. It loses its life on paper. It's our only connection to the performer and the understanding of their intentions we've pre-formulated. Because a poem is built from the ground up. Performance, at every step, reduces poetry. That's hard to disagree with, especially when what you're hearing isn't designed to be poetry on a page in the first place. Attending a Bob Dylan concert to hear him change lyrics or context for any song at will, or watching Elvis Costello or Bruce Springsteen simply shout their lyrics at you at full volume for 3 hours, or watching an 82-year-old Mick Jagger tell you he can't get no satisfaction, or Roger Daltrey declare for the 2000th time he hopes he dies before he gets old, the message is clearly subservient to the medium. There are great performance poets working today, Kai Tempest, Andrea Gibson, or Clint Smith, and you could argue that yes, performance poetry removes the personal context of reading, but on the other hand, poetry, in its origin, was a spoken tradition. Again, a penny for your thoughts. Patti Smith made an honest attempt at the largely improvisational horses, with a verse connected at the root to the audience's common experience in popular culture. While she politicised on her next and subsequent record, and her band certainly got tighter, her verse became less free, and from Wave, her fourth album, she became positively domesticated. To go within 14 months from declaring oneself a rock and roll to schmoozing with Bruce Springsteen is quite the volte-face. In May 2024, after some not inconsiderable ballyhoo beforehand, Taylor Swift proclaimed herself, not unironically, to be the secretary of the Tortured Poets Department. Before we go any further, let me come clean in so much as I am a huge admirer of Swift's work. I think she is a great American songwriter in the tradition of Carole King or Adam Schlesinger, but I'm not so huge an admirer of Taylor Swift the corporation. Well, I sort of am, because unabashed voracious capitalism always gets my thumbs up, or her frankly insane fan base, but I'm not sure how much she can be blamed or credited for their actions. Extraordinary claims such as hers require extraordinary proofs, the classic Russell's teapot, but at any level of scrutiny, it's obviously her rare gift is in the tune, the hook, the turnaround. Great American songwriter, not great American poet. Swift's gig is not so much writing what she feels, but writing what she thinks her audience feels and projects on her. That's not a bad thing. That's not a lesser thing. It's a rare and profoundly honed talent. But it's not genius, and it's far from poetry. Her songs are completely horizontal. They're more like jingles or greeting cards that move from lyrical set piece to lyrical set piece. If you could take it and put it on paper, you could, and I won't, but you could, argue that it barely rises to the standard of literature. One man working today who does understand the relationship between poetry, literature, and the songwriting process, and who has carved himself a niche in the broad but ill-lit corridor between the three, is Nick Cave. The title track on his latest album, Wild God, echoes Thomas Hyron's poem, Sometimes a Wild God.
Sometimes a wild god comes to the table. He is awkward and does not know the ways of porcelain, of fork and mustard and silver,
which in turn faintly echoes a younger Leonard Cohen. Cave is an inveterate reader of poetry. His journals are full of references to his love of reading it, and he is an accomplished novelist and at least an attempted poet. I myself haven't read any of his work, but he's always very clear that he is a lyricist. He understands, as Cohen came to understand, that the words work in service to the song. He makes no pretense to poetry, and in his journals takes umbrage when others do that on his behalf. Cave ardently believes that a song is the child of suffering and loss. Devoted as he is to Yeats, he understands where all the ladders start, in loss, in doubt, in darkness. Check out the song Long Dark Night. It's track 2, I think, on side 2 of Wild God. Through the door of my dreams burst no zombie, no ogre, no devil there, but a flying man with long trailing hair who perched on the iron rail of my bed. Oh Lord, combing his long white hair, saying my name. How could he know when I did not even know my name? That's straight up out of Yeats. His work, always florid in its biblical imagery, has shown an inexorable movement these last 15 years from an Old Testament view of human morality to a more New Testament perspective, judgment and vengeance to forgiveness and humble endurance, as he demonstrates this in his new album, that the ladder does rise above the well of sorrows, because his work, particularly over the last 25 years, is rigid in its economy, and it understands proposition, discourse and resolution. He remains one of the most intelligently literate of writers whose words contribute to the form of songs rather than remain dictated to them. Thus ends our brief and somewhat incomplete survey and roundabout defence of thesis, that popular song lyrics are not, cannot be and should not be poetry, and that any insistence that they might be is supported by nothing more than the myopic devotion of fans. Where we did not have time to look was into the world of hip-hop, where interesting new perspectives and exceptions might be had, but that has to be another story for another day. I know many will beg to differ, and please feel free to do so. I'm wide open. As they say, they're burning all the witches, even if you aren't one. So light me up.